Welcome back to Business Boone, a product of the Boone County Chamber and hosted by Deep End Talent Strategies. I'm Shauna Lake.
And I'm Lauren Byram, and today we are joined by Chris Arnold with Lasting Legacy Collective. Thank you so much for being here. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing that we like to ask all of our guests, if your life was titled a movie, what would that title be?
Yeah, and I'm glad you guys send the questions out in advance. And I've listened to a few podcasts, so I think I think mine is maybe similar to some other people that I've listened to, which is this wasn't the plan.
Yeah.
Yeah. However, it's turned out pretty good. So.
That's awesome.
Nice.
Yep.
Well, we'll get to hear maybe a little bit more about that
Yep.
and hear about your recent book and managing through crisis. But tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess I grew up in Greencastle, Indiana, and I grew up in family-owned businesses, life of entrepreneur. I can remember working alongside my mom and dad and the family as early as kindergarten.
Wow.
And so I got deep roots, and really mom and dad, being entrepreneurs, they wanted better for their kids. So they wanted us to go off to school, get good grades, and get a real job. So that's what I did. I went off to graduated from Rose-Hulman, got our engineering degree, and really knew that I didn't want to sit and do design work all day, but I felt that it was a great foundation to get into leadership roles. And so I quickly evolved into coming out of Rose into leadership roles, spent a lot of like the next 19 years of my career in what was the pre-painted metal industry, so metals industry and leadership roles, and then left that in 2008 and started doing coaching and consulting. And then along the way also, as sometimes that happens, whenever you do that, you often have clients come to you and say, hey, would you be interested in a full-time position?
Yeah.
So I had a position evolved back in 2016 for president and CEO of a indoor farming operation that originated here in Indianapolis.
Wow.
And then from that, we partnered with a Dutch company out of the Netherlands and brought their technology to the U.S. and had a pretty good ride with that company. Unfortunately, in 23, it ended up having to come to an end. So, and that's a story we can unpack another day, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there is a crisis with that, so managing through crisis.
Yeah. Well, and 2008 was a really kind of brave. It was brave to go out on your own. That was a difficult time.
Yeah. Well, and I think that ties into the story of the book. I think that's something that you kind of wanted to touch on, and what facilitated the book. And yeah, it was basically a severance package at that point in time. So I tell people that ultimately, you hear about the golden handcuffs, and that's kind of where I was at in life. Is that ultimately a lot of career success, wealth, titles, positions, all that kind of stuff, and doing pretty well. And then also from a family perspective, I mean, married my high school sweetheart. One of the claims to fame is that I was state championship quarterback in high school, and she was the homecoming queen. So yeah, so we've we had the fairy tale life in a lot of aspects of things. But as I was going through that journey, one of the things that I was also experiencing, and this is also in the book, where after the job loss, I was sitting and talking to my daughter, and we had this moment where she said, "Hey, why do you care? You haven't been home the last 5 years."
Wow.
And it was kind of one of those wake-up calls of like, she was right. I mean, ultimately, that was where I was wrestling. I had been on the road quite a bit. We built new facilities in Arkansas and a couple other things. And for that 5-year period that she's talking about, I really left out on Mondays and came back on Fridays pretty consistently. So I was lacking fulfillment at that point in time. And so I tell people I really couldn't make the decision. So, God made it for me and ultimately released me from all that, and then got to that place in life where I could kind of step back and refocus.
Yeah.
Wow. Interesting.
Yeah. So your book is called From Success to Surrender.
Yep.
So what does that transition mean to you, and what kind of prompted you to write it? Why did you want to write a story about your life?
Yeah. Yeah, so it is a teaching memoir, so it is a little bit of a story about that journey, and it's really the job loss is the actual catalyst for why the book kind of exists.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned, I had a lot of career success, but coming into this season, fortunately, I had a gift of a severance package, and I had a gift of a little bit of time. So that's one of the things I talk to people about is this: if you have the opportunity, take time to do some self-reflection. And kind of go back and really dig into, hey, the way that you're wired, your core values. What happens a lot of times is there's mission drift, so we get off on life, and we talk about mission drift in business, but that also exists in your personal life too.
Absolutely.
So I had a period of reflection that I was kind of like, okay, and then I discovered another book too called Halftime at that point in my life, and it's really targeted at people that are going through that midlife phase. Some people call it the midlife crisis. I don't really feel that mine was a crisis, but what really stuck with me out of that book was transitioning from success to significance. So I started to wrestle with, okay, what's significance look like? And things like, hey, are we created on purpose for a purpose? And if so, what is that purpose? And then beyond that, a life of serving others more so. Early on in my career, I was great about employee engagement and teams and everything, but the result of that and the outcome of all that was always a little bit too me, Chris-centered, in that point in my career. And so during that season, it was kind of like, okay, how do I look outward and start to focus more on significance? Really looks like, hey, serving others in a context of serving others.
Yeah.
The word surrender is in the book title,
Yep.
which in a traditional context is giving up.
Yep.
But you're redefining that
Yeah.
in the book. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and surrender, just a side story on surrender, Halftime. I did not know it at the time, but after the book released, I found out some of the folks from Halftime contacted me and said, hey, did you recognize that was Buford's original title? But the publisher told him, hey, it's a lousy title because nobody about the book. And it's to your point, surrender, the context of surrender is not a positive. I've even had marketing people approach me since then and say, hey, surrender is not a good context for a marketing term. So yes, I'm glad you asked the question. I mean, the reality is that it is an opportunity to just kind of redefine what that looks like. And for me, it's letting go of those things that, I wasn't meant to control. And so, it's not about giving up. I mean, again, going back to my days of fighting for a state championship early on, leader, I mean, you still fight, you do put in the work, but you kind of turn loose of a lot of the outcomes in life. So, and it's just a healthier place to live. I think another thing that kind of comes to mind with that is that when you start looking at, I historically have had a control problem. My wife would tell you that that's improved over our lifetime, but we just went to a marriage conference probably 2 weeks ago, and it came up in that conference again that, hey, control is just the natural tendency. And I think where that's rooted, control's rooted a lot of times is insecurity. And so getting to that place of understanding, okay, what are the insecurities that you're really, why are you insecure, and what's that insecurity about? Because what ends up happening is that, that's kind of just to stick with this topic briefly, because it came up with my wife and I, is like there's a pain cycle. So that insecurity leads to control. And then in her case, her pain cycle is that she feels powerless and runs to escape. So if you can see how this is feeding off of each other, I'm insecure, start to control, that ends up causing her to feel even more powerless, which ends up causing her to run to escape, which ends up spinning more insecure. So that's just a marriage context. That's a good analogy. That in leadership day to day, I mean, that's what we're also doing a lot of times whenever we're trying to control outcomes in our leadership teams. So
Interesting.
I never thought about it like that, but it's very true.
Yes, it is.
So you work with leaders every day navigating difficult situations or difficult seasons in their career or in their business. So what are some of the most common mistakes or challenges, because sometimes I don't like using the word mistakes, but challenges that people have with managing through crises?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that you have to do is kind of look at the circumstances. I think we were briefly talking about situational leadership a few weeks ago, and so it's like the situation and what is the crisis. So, the reason I kind of frame that is that I've got friends that are first responders, and when they show up at a fire on accident on scene, or heaven forbid they're dealing with an active shooter situation, I really don't want them to kind of pull the team together, have a caucus, and kind of get input from everybody about what we should do. So there is, in those situations, there's times where command and control, you want people, but even in those situations where command and control, in that crisis, they've done a tremendous amount of training.
Absolutely.
So they know their roles and responsibilities, and they've trained for that. Even in those circumstances, back when I was in leadership and corporate, I was like on the org chart, the guy in charge, but we actually had an incident commander that if there was a major event, then they were the ones trained and equipped, and basically I yielded to the incident commander for leadership. So those are the extremes. What I find most of the time in a lot of the crisis situations is that while it feels, urgent, it's probably not as urgent as what we think it is. So I think the number one thing that I see is really, emotion regulation, kind of letting yourself, experience the emotions, first of all. So you do need to kind of just validate and experience emotions. However, you need to be able to kind of calm down, bring that, and recognize that you probably got more time than what you anticipate to kind of resolve the issue and engage people in that process.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Taking a step back to reflect before you make that action is important.
Yep.
That could play into the next question, which is what role does vulnerability play in leadership during challenging times, and how have you seen that impact outcomes?
Yeah. First half of my life, I wasn't very vulnerable as a leader. Since that time, though, man, it has been, I discovered Patrick Lenciani, and so if I had dysfunction in the team, he talks about vulnerability-based trust. Brene Brown is huge. She's on vulnerability and trust. And so I've really become a student of trust and the importance of vulnerability in relationships. So, in crisis, I think that it is important to be able to be vulnerable and say, hey, I don't have all the answers. And so I think it's just an important step. I told you in 2023, we ended up having to back out of the indoor farming operations here in the U.S. And there was a location here in Indianapolis that unfortunately we had to shut down at that point in time. Those are difficult circumstances. However, I think most people would tell you that I was very open and communicating throughout the process. So the day that we had to make the final decision, it was still a surprise for folks, but ultimately it wasn't a huge surprise. And I think that that better equipped them, and they would say that from a leadership standpoint, they appreciated the vulnerability and transparency.
Yeah. Could you share, thinking about some of the different crises that you've been in or things that have impacted your career, can you kind of share a moment from your own journey where a crisis really helped to, or not maybe helped, but reshaped your perspective on success?
Yeah, I think the immediate is kind of going back to that job loss season. Again, that was probably the big takeaway at that point in time. Sure. Yeah, if you go back to the job loss aspects of things. But even in the shutting down of the operation, you go through. There was another gentleman that I was on a podcast that is called Beyond the Crucible. He talks about crucible experiences in life, and so what really came out of that is like most people that have been through a lot of those crucible moments. It's kind of like what I said before. This wasn't the plan, but it's like it's better, and there's something better on the other side.
I agree.
However, that doesn't make it easy getting through the circumstances. No. So for me, what I've seen in most my life, as well as a lot of other people's lives, is that it's through the challenges, through those valleys that you have to wrestle with. But on the other side of it, there's something much more positive and exciting and inspiring.
Yeah. I agree. I've been through a reduction force. She's been through a reduction force, and I'm better for it, and I know she's better for it.
Yeah.
That's how we got to deep end. But it's like,
Absolutely.
It's so hard to see through that. When you're in that moment, it's so hard to see that other side.
Yep. I was not quite likely. I heard a little bit of her story last week, and like in the first 20 minutes, I think your business plan kind of came together.
Yes, it did. In a 20-minute
as well as your
drive.
brand too.
Yeah, 20-minute drive home after that happened. And as leaders, I think having been through that, it gives you much more empathy when you have to be the one sitting on the other side of the table of those conversations. When you've had to be the recipient of that conversation. Even though I had to let thousands of people go in my career, I do it in a different way now, having had that happen to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
You talked about having to go through those difficult seasons, and it might not be easy, but you just have to keep going through it, which kind of sounds like a country music song. But for someone
Can you
who
sing it for us?
that would be the fastest way to get someone to end this podcast. For someone who's currently in the middle of a difficult situation, what practical steps can they take to keep moving from simply surviving it to actually going through it and growing through it?
Yeah. I think first step is to acknowledge the pain. So it is okay to acknowledge. I'm getting ready to say a word. I think it's okay to say suck. It sucks. It sucks.
It sure is, yeah.
So acknowledge that and experience that, and to some extent grieve it. Right. So there is a grieving process a lot of times when we're going through crises, and so it's being able to spend time in that. And then that is the second part of for me is like, okay, don't rush in to try to fix the problem. Take the time. We've used career transitions as kind of an example, so I'll just continue to use that as an example. I mean, whenever I'm working with somebody that's in a career transition, I'm always trying to get them to kind of look out and say, okay, what's your runway? How much time do you really have to actually make a decision? And I encourage them the first third of that, just spend time, self-reflection, don't really try to chase after anything, and just stay open to the world of possibility in that. So overall, I think that's the big thing is coming back and, again, experiencing it, recognizing that it's not the end of the world, and there could be something that's extraordinary on the other side of this, and just staying open to the possibility and just seeing where things go from there.
I wish I would have had that advice when I was going through my situation being downsized. So
yeah,
absolutely.
Because ultimately, I mean, I could have run off and gotten another corporate job. At the if I'd done the traditional thing, I would have been looking for a corporate job. I would have probably moved my family and done some other things that, looking back on it, I'm so blessed and pleased the fact that things ended up the way they have.
Yeah, everything happens for a reason. I'm a firm believer in that.
Yeah. Yep.
You've already shared a lot of things that you've learned over your journey, but is there anything else that you'd like to share, something that you know now that you wish you had known earlier in your career?
Yeah, going way back in my career, I would say, hey, it's not about me. And so really, again, I had feedback early on. Even though I was successful, I did have feedback at one point in time that said, hey, you're a little bit arrogant. And so, I don't know that I appreciated the feedback at the time, but looking back on it, I mean, I had a little bit of pride and arrogance to me. Not that I was totally out of control, but looking back on it, it was a lot about Chris in the early years. So making that shift and starting to look through the lens of, hey, how can you help other people and be successful? And making that shift earlier in life would probably be what I would say.
Yeah, thank you.
Good advice. So if something resonated with some of our viewers or listeners today, how could they get in touch with you?
Yeah, good question. So I'm on LinkedIn, so it's easy to find me on LinkedIn. Our website is lastinglegacycollective.com, so that's also another easy way to find it as well. So.
Wonderful.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us, Chris, and telling us about your story.
Yep.
And hopefully people will read the book and learn more.
Yeah, thanks for the invite.
Yes.
Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. And we will be back with more insightful conversations. Until then, continue leading and growing with purpose.